You wake up in the morning, the alarm goes off, and you drag yourself out of bed.
As we all do.
Right. But you walk into the kitchen, you grind the beans, and you brew a cup of coffee.
It is basically the most mundane, unquestionable sequence of events in the human experience.
Exactly. I mean, there is you, right? The person making the coffee.
The doer.
Yeah, the doer. And then there's the physical exertion, like the grinding, the pouring.
Not doing.
And then there's the result. A hot mug of caffeine sitting right there on the counter. The done.
And it feels as solid as the actual mug in your hand.
It really does. But if someone told you that this entire sequence, like the very architecture of cause and effect, was just a fundamental delusion, well, you'd probably think they were completely out of their mind.
Or, you'd recognize them as a profoundly radical philosopher who's trying to cure a cognitive disease that you didn't even know you had.
Which is exactly where we find ourselves today.
Jumping straight back into the deep end.
We really are. And look, since you, our listener, have already waded through the really rigorous reality-bending logic of the previous 4 chapters of Nāgārjuna's Mulamadhyamakakarika, the MMK. Yeah, you know the drill by now.
You've survived the deconstruction of causality, of motion, perception, and the aggregates.
Yeah, so you understand the methodology. Today, we aren't doing some beginner's orientation. We're stepping directly into the clinic.
And Nāgārjuna's the attending surgeon.
Perfect way to put it. So today, what's the mission?
The procedure today is monumental. We are taking on Chapter 8 of the MMK, which is the analysis of the producer and the product.
Okay.
At its core, this chapter is a totally systematic dismantling of the production of karma, or, well, truthfully, the production of anything at all.
And I want to be clear right up front. The goal here isn't to leave us floating in some terrifying dark void where nothing matters and morality is just a joke.
Definitely not. That's a huge misconception.
Right. The goal is to cure what Nāgārjuna diagnoses as the disease of reification. Like our compulsive need to turn fluid processes into solid absolute things.
Exactly.
So we are going to take the Madhyamaka logic, apply it to the building blocks of action, and dissolve them.
And by the end of this conversation, those rigid boxes of cause, action, and effect are going to break open.
To reveal a reality that is far more interconnected, fractal, and limitless than this everyday illusion we take for granted.
But, to perform that kind of philosophical surgery, we first have to isolate the patient on the operating table.
Right. Who is the patient here?
In Nāgārjuna's time, the patient was the Abhidharma framework of reality, and specifically their understanding of what we call the 3 spheres of action.
Okay, so we need to look closely at what these spheres actually are, and more importantly, why the Abhidharma thinkers believed in them so fiercely.
Yeah, so let's go back to your coffee example. Whenever we do anything, our minds naturally construct reality into a triad.
A 3-part system.
Exactly. There are 3 spheres at play. First, we have the actor, the producer, the agent. In Sanskrit, this is the kāraka.
KARAKA, okay.
Second, we have the action itself. The mechanism of production, the karana.
Karana.
Got it. And third, we have the result, the product, or the karma, which is the phala.
So karaka, karana, and phala. The actor, the action, the result.
Right. And the Abhidharma schools, particularly the Sarvāstivāda tradition, they didn't just see these as linguistic conveniences.
They weren't just grammar rules to them.
No, they were highly systematic, almost scientific in their approach to Buddhist doctrine. They viewed these 3 spheres as real dharmas.
Okay, well, let's just pause on that word for a second. Dharmas. Because in this specific context, it has a very technical meaning, right? It's not dharma in the general sense of the Buddha's teachings.
Correct. In the Abhidharma psychological and physical mapping of the universe, dharmas are the irreducible fundamental building blocks of reality.
Like ontological subatomic particles.
Exactly. And the crucial characteristic of a real dharma is that it possesses svabhāva.
Svabhāva, meaning inherent existence.
Yes. Absolute, independent, self-contained essence.
Okay, let me unpack this. Because the Sarvāstivāda scholars argued that for the universe to function, these fundamental building blocks must possess their own inherent reality.
They absolutely insisted on it.
So to them, the producer, the kāraka, isn't just a fleeting idea. It's a momentary but fundamentally real aggregate of factors that initiates an action.
Right. And the production of the karana is a real, almost physical causal force driven by a deeply real intention, or satana.
And then the product, the phala, is a real, undeniable consequence that actually shapes your trajectory through samsara, the cycle of rebirth.
You've got it perfectly.
Well, I want to play devil's advocate for the Abhidharma here for a minute. Because their view makes absolute intuitive sense to my everyday brain.
Sure, it's how we all naturally think.
Right. They were looking at reality like it was built out of cosmic Lego bricks. The actor is red brick. The action is a blue brick. The result is a yellow brick.
And you just snap them together.
Yeah, you snap them together and you build the karmic cycle. Like if I walk into the kitchen to make that coffee, my heart rate elevates. My muscles contract. I physically displace air in the room.
Unquestionably.
There is undeniably me doing the walking, a physical action of walking, occurring in time and space and a destination being reached. It feels intensely physically real.
It does.
So why was Nāgārjuna coming after this? Why does he consider our belief in the absolute reality of these three spheres a profound delusion?
Well, it's vital to understand what Nāgārjuna is not saying here.
Okay.
He isn't denying the conventional experience of walking. He is not some physical solipsist telling you that your legs don't exist or that the coffee isn't hot.
Because if you pour boiling water on your hand, you will absolutely burn yourself.
Exactly. The conventional functionality of the world remains perfectly intact. What he is attacking is the subconscious, deeply ingrained philosophical assumption we attach to that experience.
He's attacking the svabhāva.
Yes. He's attacking the assumption that the red, blue, and yellow Lego bricks are made of solid, independent plastic.
Oh, I see.
We assume that you, the coffee maker, have a solid, unchanging essence of you-ness that exists totally independently of the coffee in the kitchen.
And we assume the action of making coffee is a distinct, isolated force.
Right. But Nāgārjuna forces us to look at the relationships. An actor is entirely defined by the action.
Because you cannot be called a walker until you begin the act of walking.
Precisely. And the action of walking is entirely defined by the presence of an actor and a medium to walk through. You can't have an abstract, disembodied walk happening all on its own.
It's a relational definition. It's like trying to find the essence of a parent completely independent of a child.
That's a great analogy.
Because the very millisecond a child is born, the parent is simultaneously brought into existence. You cannot isolate parentness and place it in a vacuum. It literally requires the counterpart to exist at all.
And if something requires a counterpart to exist, it cannot, by definition, possess independent, self-contained existence.
It lacks svabhāva.
It lacks svabhāva. But see, the Sarvāstivādin scholars were terrified of this idea.
Boy, terrified.
They believe that if you strip away the inherent existence of the actor, the action, and the result, the entire moral framework of Buddhism collapses.
Oh, because if there's no absolutely real actor who commits a bad deed and no absolutely real karmic fruit that results from it, then why be good?
Exactly. They clung to inherent existence to protect ethics from nihilism.
So Nāgārjuna isn't just picking a semantic fight over definitions. He is engaging in a massive, high-stakes, philosophical battle for the very soul of Buddhist ethics.
Yes, the stakes are incredibly high.
And to prove that the Abhidharma's solid building blocks are actually empty, he brings out the heavy machinery.
Step 2. The four-cornered logic that leaves no survivors.
The tetralemma.
The tetralemma is the crucible. We are going to apply it relentlessly to verses 1 through 11 of Chapter 8.
Okay, walk us through it.
The logic demands that we test 4 possible extreme positions regarding the 3 spheres. We must test if they are inherently existent.
That's 1.
If they are completely non-existent.
That's 2.
If they're somehow both. Or if they are neither.
And Nāgārjuna's method is basically to walk down every single one of these logical corridors, take the opponent's premise to its absolute, uncompromising limit, and show how it invariably shatters into contradiction and absurdity.
That is the Madhyamaka way.
Okay, let's walk down that first corridor. The first horn of the tetralemma, the realm of existence and non-existence, which covers the first 6 verses.
Let's start with the real versus real argument.
Right, so the opponent says, okay, Nāgārjuna, the producer, inherently exists, and the product inherently exists. They are absolute, solid realities.
And Nāgārjuna's response is fascinating. He doesn't say that's impossible. He says it's completely redundant.
It's a brilliant counterintuitive move.
Yeah.
Let's look at how verse 1 is structured in the translation.
What does it say?
It essentially states, an existent doer does not do an existent deed.
Why? Because inherent existence, svabhāva, implies absolute completion. If something inherently exists, it doesn't rely on conditions to become what it is.
It already fully is.
Right.
So if the producer is a fully established absolute reality, and the product is a fully established absolute reality, the act of production serves 0 purpose.
Yes.
I always try to ground this in the classic seed and sprout analogy used in the commentaries, because if the seed and the sprout both possess absolute, independent existence, then the sprout doesn't need the seed.
It goes even deeper than that, actually. If the seed possesses absolute unchanging seedness, it can never stop being a seed.
It's locked in stasis.
Yes. For a sprout to emerge, the seed must break down, decay, and cease to be a seed. It must be vulnerable to conditions like water, soil, and sunlight.
Right. If the seed is an absolute indestructible unit of svabhāva, it's basically a little steel ball bearing.
That's the perfect mental image.
You can plant a ball bearing, water it, and shine light on it for 1,000 years, and it will never, ever sprout. It cannot transform.
And on the flip side, if the product, the sprout, already inherently exists in the absolute sense, it doesn't need to be produced. It's already fully established.
Right. The action of growing becomes a completely meaningless concept. You cannot build a house that is already built.
So if we claim the spheres are inherently existent, the very mechanism of causality freezes up. The universe becomes a static, motionless diorama.
Okay, so absolute existence results in a frozen universe.
Yes.
And the opponent sees this trap and immediately pivots to the second half of verse 1. They say, fine, then let's look at non-real versus non-real. The producer is completely non-existent, and the product is completely non-existent.
And Nāgārjuna responds, neither does a non-existent doer do a non-existent deed.
This one is much more straightforward, I think.
It is. Can a total void produce a total void? No, because a total void possesses zero causal efficacy.
Right. You cannot water a non-existent sprout. You can't have a non-existent farmer planting a phantom seed, performing a non-existent harvest to yield imaginary grain that somehow feeds a completely non-existent village.
The math just doesn't work.
If there's absolutely nothing there, the equation is just 0 times 0 equals 0. Nothing happens.
And this sets the stage for a really dramatic escalation in the text.
Oh yeah, verses 4 and 5.
Yes. Nāgārjuna takes the abstract logic we just discussed and aims it directly at the throat of the Abhidharma moral framework.
He wants to show them that their desperate attempt to save karma through inherent existence is actually the very thing destroying it.
Let's break down how he does it.
Well, we pull up the Strang translation for verse 5 because it's a hammer blow. It reads, if the producing action, etc., do not exist, then neither can the true reality, dharma, nor false reality, adharma, exist. If neither the true reality nor the false reality exists, then also the product, phala, born from that, does not exist.
We really need to unpack the underlying mechanism of what he's doing here.
Please do.
The Abhidharma scholars divided the world into two categories. There was true reality, the dharmas, the absolute building blocks that have actual causal power.
Right.
And there was false reality adharmas, which are just conceptual illusions created by the mind, like the idea of a permanent soul or a unified self. The Abhidharma insisted that morality only works if the actions creating karma are real dharmas.
But Nāgārjuna just proved in verses 1 through 3 that an inherently real producing action is a logical impossibility.
Exactly. It leads to a frozen universe.
And a non-existent producing action is also impossible because it has no power. So the producing action cannot be categorized as an absolute dharma, nor can it be an absolute adharma.
Precisely. And if the producing action cannot exist in either of those absolute categories, the entire binary system of dharmas and adharmas collapses.
Wow, the foundation of the opponent's worldview just disintegrates.
And verse 5 delivers the final consequence. If the system of real and false elements collapses, then the phala, the karmic product, the result of the action cannot possibly be generated.
He traps them in their own maze.
He really does.
If you demand that the universe be made of absolute independent parts, the gears of the universe lock up. If the gears lock up, there's no action. If there is no action, there's no karma.
And if there is no karma, there is no cycle of rebirth, and there is no liberation from it.
Nāgārjuna looks at the Sarvāstivādin scholars and basically says, by trying to make karma absolute, you have accidentally murdered it.
It's an intellectual judo flip.
It is devastatingly effective. But, the human mind is stubborn, especially when its core beliefs are threatened.
Very true. When existence and non-existence fail, the mind searches for a loophole.
Which takes us to the third corridor of the tetralemma explored in verses 7 and 8.
Yes. What if the producer is both real and non-real?
Let me guess, Nāgārjuna has no patience for this.
None whatsoever. Verse 7 shuts it down with surgical precision. It states that a doer that exists and yet does not exist cannot perform an action.
Why?
Because existence and non-existence are mutually contradictory. They cannot occupy the same entity at the same time in the same respect.
Right, it's the philosophical equivalent of trying to draw a square circle.
Exactly.
I mean, you can string the words square and circle together in a sentence. You can say, I am a solid, absolute entity, but I am also a complete non-existent void. The syntax works.
But conceptually, it represents a catastrophic system failure.
Yeah, you are demanding that reality accommodate two entirely opposed absolute states simultaneously. It just doesn't work.
And when that fails, the opponent, now really desperate, tries the fourth and final corridor.
The neither option.
Right. Okay, Nāgārjuna. The producer is neither existent nor non-existent. Verses 9 through 11 dismantle this final refuge.
How does he dismantle neither? Because honestly, neither sounds kind of mystical and profound.
It does.
It sounds like the kind of thing a wise sage on a mountain would say.
It does sound profound, which is exactly why it's such a seductive trap. But Nāgārjuna points out that logically, the neither option is just a cop-out.
How so?
It's an attempt to smuggle inherent existence back into the picture through a back door. By saying something is neither real nor non-real, the opponent is trying to establish a mysterious, ungraspable third state of reality.
A state that conveniently bypasses the logical contradictions of the first three options. They are basically saying, my Lego brick is made of a secret, invisible material that doesn't follow your rules, but it's still definitely a solid brick.
That's intellectual cheating.
It really is.
But if you strip away the mystical phrasing, neither is still attempting to posit a foundational essence. Nāgārjuna's earlier arguments have already definitively proven that any absolute foundation, regardless of what mysterious label you slap on it, cannot interact with conditions.
Yeah, because it's still a steel ball bearing, even if it's an invisible mystical one.
Right. It cannot transform and therefore cannot initiate an action or produce a result.
Okay, before we move on from the tetralemma, I want to bring up a specific logical trap mentioned in the commentaries that I found incredibly illuminating regarding how language tricks us into these extreme views.
Ah, yes. The two motions fallacy.
Yes, the deconstruction of the agent and the act.
Walk us through it.
So, we instinctively use grammar to separate the world. Subject, verb, object, a walk to the store, I'm the subject, walking is the verb. If I hold on to the Abhidharma view of absolute reality, I must argue that I, the goer, am an inherently different, separate entity from the walking that I am doing. I possess the action, but I am not the action.
Which sounds completely reasonable on a conventional level.
Right, but Nāgārjuna says, let's take that to its absolute limit. If the goer and the going are entirely different, inherently separate entities, a bizarre physical paradox emerges.
Because the very identity of a goer requires motion.
Exactly. If you strip away the act of going, the goer ceases to be a goer. So the absolute identity of the goer contains one motion.
Yes, the defining essence of the agent.
But then, this goer performs a physical action in the real world. They walk to the store. That is a second motion. If the agent and the action are inherently separate, you now have two distinct motions happening. And logic dictates that two separate motions require two separate movers.
You end up with a phantom duplicate. You have the absolute essence of a goer who isn't physically moving, and you have a disembodied physical act of motion floating down the street without a person attached to it.
It's ridiculous. The linguistic separation, when taken as an absolute physical reality, just shatters the unity of the event.
It sounds like a strange riddle, but it exposes the core flaw.
Because our grammar creates a noun and a verb, we then project that grammar onto physics, assuming the universe is made of isolated nouns performing isolated verbs.
Nāgārjuna uses the two motions fallacy to prove that separating them absolutely is literal nonsense.
Which brings us to the profound pivot point of Chapter 8, and really of Madhyamaka logic as a whole.
We have executed steps 1 and 2.
We identified the three spheres, and we subjected them to the tetralemma.
And we have exhaustively proven that the producer, the action, and the product cannot be real, they cannot be unreal, they cannot be both, and they cannot be neither.
The absolute inherent reality of these spheres has been utterly vaporized.
Gone.
Which leaves me looking around my room, feeling slightly unmoored. Because my microphone is still here, my coffee is still here, I am still here.
It's a disorienting feeling.
So if the tetralemma destroys absolute reality, what exactly are we left with? If there are no solid Lego bricks, what is the universe actually made of?
This transition is the most critical moment in understanding Nāgārjuna. We move from relentless deconstruction to profound realization. Steps 3 and 4 of the logic.
Okay, let's get into it.
Step 3 is the definitive conclusion. Because the tetralemma fails in every possible direction, the three spheres are entirely, utterly empty of inherent existence.
They possess zero svabhāva.
Right. This is the realization of the second truth, emptiness. Because they are empty, the absolute production of karma, or the absolute production of anything at all, is impossible.
Okay, emptiness. But emptiness isn't nothingness.
Crucially, no, emptiness is not a void, which is why step 3 immediately demands step 4.
That was step 4.
Step 4 reveals the actual mechanics of the universe. If things don't exist absolutely, how do they exist? They exist through dependent origination. They are dependently co-originated, inseparable, co-defined, and co-emergent.
They are mere designations, conceptual labels, applied by the mind to a fluid, interconnected process.
Yes. This is the first truth-dependent origination.
Emptiness and dependent origination, the twin engines of Nāgārjuna's philosophy.
Indeed.
But to see how these engines power the deconstruction of karma in Chapter 8, I need to bring up a major terminological headache that comes up in the source texts.
The word karma itself.
Yes. As I was reading, I kept getting confused because Nāgārjuna seems to use the word karma to mean two completely different things in different verses.
It can be very tricky for modern readers.
Like sometimes karma is the action, the doing.
Right.
Sometimes karma is the result, the thing that happens later. Is this just sloppy translation?
It is not sloppy translation at all. It is an incredibly precise, strategic exploitation of the Abhidharma's own terminology.
Okay. Yeah.
We have to look at the Sanskrit. The word karma stems from the root kri, which simply means to do or to make. In the Abhidharma framework, karma is primarily the intentional action, the kriya. It is the volitional impulse that sets things in motion.
Like the seed being planted, the act of stealing or the act of giving.
Yes. But in the broader Buddhist cosmological framework, karma also refers to the eventual consequence, the phala, the fruit of that action that ripens later in samsara.
Like a painful experience in this life or a favorable rebirth in the next.
Exactly.
The fruit growing on the tree 10 years after the seed was planted.
Yeah.
So karma is both the cause and the effect.
Exactly. And Nāgārjuna uses this dual definition like a vice grip.
Oh, I see where this is going.
By targeting karma as the action, the kriya, he uses the tetralemma to collapse the causal process. He proves that the act of producing cannot exist independently.
And then?
Then, by targeting karma as the result, the phala, he collapses the outcome. He proves that the product cannot exist independently.
Because if the action is empty due to interdependence, no absolute karmic result can ever arise.
Right, and if the absolute result is empty, the action that supposedly produced it loses its absolute meaning.
He attacks both ends of the bridge simultaneously until the whole structure just falls into the river.
A perfect metaphor.
This brings up one of the most conceptually rich ideas in the sources, what they call the loop of the conditioning producer.
That is a phenomenal framework for understanding the mechanics of samsara.
I really want to visualize this because when I mapped this out, it was a massive aha moment for me regarding how emptiness actually works in practice.
Walk us through the map.
Okay, imagine a person, the producer, but they aren't a blank slate dropped into the universe. They are a conditioned producer.
Right. They arrive heavily shaped by conditions.
Exactly. They arrive in this current moment heavily shaped by their past environment, their genetics, their past thoughts, basically, their previous karma.
Okay.
This conditioned producer then decides to perform an action. But the action isn't random. It is a conditioning action, highly influenced by the producer's specific state.
Let's use an example.
Let's say a deeply anxious person acts defensively in an argument.
So the conditioned producer performs a conditioning action.
Exactly. Now, that defensive action generates a result, a product. They push a friend away. But the loop doesn't stop there.
What does that result do?
It immediately feeds backward and updates the producer's conditioning. The loss of the friend reinforces the internal anxiety, making the producer even more conditioned and even more likely to act defensively in the future.
The feedback loop is closed.
It's an infinite, unbreakable circuit. Karma is acting as the conditioner and the conditioned at every single microscopic step.
The action conditions the result.
The result conditions the producer.
The producer conditions the next action.
It's an Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail. And this explains the linguistic ambiguity perfectly.
Yes, it does.
The same word, karma, is used for both the action and the result because they aren't two different things. They're two vantage points on the exact same continuous loop.
That is an exceptional visualization. And it leads directly to the core insight of Madhyamaka. Why does this loop function? It functions only because of emptiness.
Wait, emptiness is what makes the loop work.
Let's apply the Abhidharma's svabhāva to your map.
Okay.
If the anxious producer had a solid, inherent, unchanging, absolute essence of anxiety, they could never change.
Oh, they can never be updated by a new result.
Right. The loop would freeze into stone. If the defensive action was an absolute, unchanging entity, it couldn't dynamically interact with the friend's reaction.
So emptiness, the total lack of a fixed absolute essence, is the necessary flexibility that allows the loop to turn.
Emptiness allows dependent origination to occur.
If things were solid, they couldn't move. Because they're empty, they can dance.
Precisely. Which brings us flawlessly to step 5 of the diagnostic. The union of the two truths, the U2T.
The union of the two truths.
The three spheres are empty because they dependently co-arise, and they can only dependently co-arise because they are empty of a fixed essence.
So emptiness and dependent origination are not two different phenomena. They are synonymous.
Exactly. One truth entirely implies, supports, and energizes the other.
And realizing this union leads us to step 6, which shifts the tone from logic to almost like poetry.
It really does.
Step 6 concludes that because these spheres are an empty, co-arising loop, they're ultimately like illusions, like reflections in a mirror, like mirages. They are functionally there, yet absolutely not there.
This is beautifully crystallized in verse 12 of chapter 8. The Garfield translation handles this elegantly. Action depends upon the agent itself depends on action. One cannot see any way to establish them differently.
Nāgārjuna is formally laying out the pure interdependence we just mapped out in the feedback loop.
He is, but the deeper philosophical commentaries point out something really radical about verse 12.
What's that?
This verse isn't just about how a person makes a cup of coffee. This verse is revealing the actual nature of nirvana.
I remember reading this in the sources and having to reread it 3 times. How does a verse about an actor and an action explain the ultimate spiritual goal of Buddhism?
Because it forces a complete redefinition of what nirvana actually is.
Okay, because for the Abhidharma schools, and frankly for how most people casually understand Buddhism today, nirvana is conceptualized as an escape pod.
It's seen as an alternate dimension.
Right. It's a pristine, unconditioned, absolute realm that you desperately try to reach in order to escape the messy, painful, interconnected web of samsara.
Samsara is the burning building.
And nirvana is the helicopter waiting on the roof. You punch your ticket out of the karmic cycle and leave the building behind.
But verse 12, by proving that the actor and the act only exist in dependence on each other, shatters that dualism completely.
No.
If the entire karmic cycle is dependently originated, then the karmic cycle is entirely empty of inherent existence. It has no absolute substance.
Okay.
And if it has no absolute substance, what is there to escape from?
You can't flee a burning building if the building is a hologram.
Exactly. Nirvana is not a destination. It is not an alternate reality. Nirvana is simply the direct, experiential, unmediated realization of the true, empty dynamic of the samsaric cycle.
Right.
Samsara and nirvana are the exact same ontological reality.
I want to make sure I'm really grasping the magnitude of this.
Yeah.
You were saying the world of suffering and the world of ultimate liberation are the exact same physical space.
They're the same reality experienced through 2 different lenses.
Okay, break that down.
When you look at the karmic cycle, your job, your relationships, your actions with ignorance, when you reify the actor, the action, and the result into absolute solid things that you must desperately cling to or fight against, that perception is samsara.
That grasping is the very mechanics of suffering.
Yes. But when you look at the exact same job, the exact same relationships, with wisdom recognizing them as an empty, fluid, dependently originated mirage, that perception is nirvana.
Liberation isn't leaving the world. It's seeing the world accurately.
Exactly.
When you truly realize that this cycle has no solid parts, no absolute starting line, and no absolute finish line, the whole geometry of how we view the universe shifts.
It has to shift.
The sources use a string of adjectives to describe reality at this stage that absolutely blew my mind. They call it an inconceivable, continuous, limitless, and centerless, nonlinear, holographic, fractal-like cycle.
It's quite a mouthful.
It sounds like science fiction, but it's second-century philosophy. Let's break that down, because it perfectly captures the Madhyamaka vision. Why holographic?
Well, think about the physics of a hologram. Unlike a standard photograph, if you cut a holographic plate in half, you don't get half the image.
You get the entire image, just slightly less resolve.
Right. Every single microscopic piece of a hologram contains the information of the entire whole.
And how does that map to karma and action?
Because of profound interdependence, every single action you take implicitly contains the entire web of the universe.
Like the coffee cup.
Yes. When you hold that cup of coffee, you aren't just holding a discrete object. You are holding the rain that watered the soil in Colombia, the labor of the farmer, the combustion engine of the shipping freighter, the heat of the sun.
You cannot isolate a single moment or a single object that doesn't rely on and therefore contain the entire cosmos.
The universe is folded into the coffee cup.
And why a fractal?
Yeah.
Because a fractal repeats its fundamental geometric pattern at every conceivable scale of magnification.
Right.
The feedback loop of the conditioning producer, the arising of a thought, the resulting emotion, the updated mental state, that microloop occurring in a fraction of a second, is the exact same structural empty loop as the birth, life, and collapse of a galaxy over billions of years.
It scales infinitely.
And it's centerless. There is no original prime mover, no original coder to the software, and no final destination. It is just an endless, fluid, ungraspable dance of co-creation.
Which brings us back to the vital conclusion of Step 6. Because it is an endless, fluid dance of interdependent conditions, devoid of any solid essence, it is ultimately a mirage. It is there, yet not there.
Okay, here's where I have to step in and push back. Hard.
I was waiting for this.
Because this is the exact moment where a modern, scientifically minded listener is going to throw their hands up and walk away.
Fair enough.
I get the fractal poetry. I love the holographic metaphor. But let's get out of the cosmos and back onto the street.
Let's do it.
If I am walking down the sidewalk and I am not paying attention and I run headfirst into a solid brick wall, I break my nose.
Unpleasant, but yes.
The cartilage snaps, my eyes water. The pain in my nervous system is blindingly intense. The blood dripping down my face is real. The $500 emergency room bill is undeniably real.
All true.
How on earth can you, or Nāgārjuna, sit there in an armchair and tell me that the brick wall is an illusion or a mirage? It feels incredibly dismissive, almost insulting, to the reality of my broken nose.
That is the ultimate necessary pushback. If we don't clarify this, Madhyamaka sounds like a dangerous form of madness or nihilistic denial.
It really does.
We have to draw a razor-sharp distinction between absolute reality, which we are refuting, and conventional functionality, which we are firmly affirming.
Okay, explain the distinction.
When Nāgārjuna says the wall is a mirage, he is emphatically not saying it is a hallucination. He's not suggesting that if you close your eyes, breathe deeply, and believe hard enough, you can walk through the brick wall like a ghost.
Okay, good. Because I definitely can't. The wall always wins.
The wall wins because conventional reality functions. The neurological pain, the physical blood, the hospital bill, these are perfect, flawless, undeniable examples of dependent origination working exactly as it should conventionally.
Right. Cause and effect happening in real time.
The biological matter of your face interacted with the atomic structure of the wall according to the strict laws of physics, causing a rapid response in your nervous system. That is conventional truth. It is functionally real. Nāgārjuna never denies function.
So if the function is real and the pain is real, where exactly does the illusion come in? What is the mirage?
The illusion does not lie in the physical collision. The illusion lies in your mind's instantaneous assumption that the wall possesses an absolute, independent, eternal wallness.
You're saying my mind reifies the wall in the fraction of a second before I hit it.
Yes. On an absolute level, the wall is completely empty. It is a temporary, highly conditional aggregation of atoms, chemical bonds, architectural forces, and human conceptual labels.
Right. If you view that wall on a quantum level, it is 99.9% empty space with fields of probability interacting.
Exactly. And if you view that wall on a geological timescale of millions of years, it isn't a wall at all. It's just dust that blew together and will eventually blow away.
It is a temporary event, not an eternal truth.
But our human minds are desperate for stability. So we look at this temporary, fluid, functional web of conditions, and we project a solid, unyielding, eternal essence onto it.
And that projected essence is the mirage.
That is the mirage.
So I am interacting with a temporary cluster of conditions, but my brain insists I am interacting with a fundamental pillar of reality.
Exactly. The wall is a karmic mirage. It is a highly functional reality born of specific conditions, but it is utterly devoid of absolute substance. It will break your nose, but it will not last forever.
Okay, that distinction saves the philosophy for me. Function versus absolute essence. But this brings up a massive, almost insurmountable logistical problem.
Which is?
If everything, me, the wall, the action of walking, the universe itself is a karmic mirage, how do we even talk about it?
Language.
The very language we use, nouns, verbs, subjects, objects, forces us to treat things as absolute solid entities. Every sentence I speak is a trap. How do we discuss reality without immediately falling back into the linguistic habit of reification?
You have hit upon the fundamental limitation of language, and this is precisely why Nāgārjuna refuses to stop at the simple tetralemma.
We need more logic.
We do. To prevent language from trapping us, he forces us to expand our logic to the generalized tetralemma. This brings us to steps 7 and 9 of our diagnostic.
And just to clarify the structure for our journey, the specific Madhyamaka framework we are utilizing moves directly from step 7 to step 9, as step 8 involves a different subset of reasoning not required for this specific deconstruction.
Yes.
So what exactly is the generalized tetralemma in step 7?
Step 7 takes the fourfold negation we used earlier, not real, not unreal, not both, not neither, and scales it up.
Scales it up how?
It generalizes the formula to apply to literally every single conceptual framework, every duality, every linguistic category the human mind can possibly construct.
Wow.
We use the generalized tetralemma to affirm that the three spheres and reality itself are not this, they are not non-this, they are not both, and they are not neither, for whatever concept this happens to be.
So it's an algorithm. You plug any human concept into the formula, and the formula destroys its absolute validity.
Precisely. Let's run the algorithm on the classic philosophical dualities. Reality is not permanent, and it is not impermanent.
It is not continuous, and it is not discontinuous.
It is not separate, and it is not united.
It is not many, and it is not one.
Exactly. It evades every single rigid conceptual enclosure we try to trap it in. Any word you use to describe absolute reality is fundamentally inadequate because words demand boundaries, and reality has none.
And recognizing that total failure of language and conceptualization leads us directly to step 9, which concludes that the only valid, accurate attitude to adopt toward reality is the middle way.
Yes, the middle way. But we must be incredibly careful here because the term middle way is often profoundly misunderstood, especially when viewed through a Western lens.
Right, in the West, we hear middle way and we think of Aristotle's golden mean. We think of compromise.
Like meeting in the middle.
Yeah, if one person says the thermostat should be 60 degrees and the other says 80, the middle way is 70 degrees. It's a lukewarm point halfway between two extremes.
That is exactly what the Madhyamaka middle way is not. It is not a compromise. It is not a blending of extremes.
What is it then?
It is a cognitive stance, entirely, radically free from all extremes. It completely abandons the spectrum itself.
So it drops the thermostat entirely.
Yes. It transcends objectivism, which claims things possess absolute independent reality, and it equally transcends nihilism, which claims nothing exists at all.
It transcends dualism, the idea that the universe is fundamentally broken into separate parts.
And crucially, it transcends monism, the idea that everything is just one giant, undifferentiated cosmic blob.
The middle way has nothing to accept or seek in absolute terms, and absolutely nothing to reject or abandon in absolute terms.
Correct.
You know, hearing this massive list of negations, not this, not that, not one, not many, it can sound deeply frustrating at first. It feels like someone is standing next to you, constantly slapping the tools out of your cognitive toolbox, just as you reach for them.
Nope, can't use permanence. Nope, can't use oneness.
Nope, can't use separation. It induces a kind of intellectual vertigo.
It really does.
But when you actually sit with that vertigo for a moment, the psychological relief that follows is profound.
How so? What is the relief?
Think about how much vital emotional energy we spend trying to figure out the ultimate, absolute nature of our identity.
A lot of energy.
Am I a permanent, eternal soul? Or am I just a biological machine that rots into nothingness? Am I entirely separate from the universe, completely alone? Or am I meant to dissolve into some cosmic oneness where my individuality doesn't exist? We torture ourselves with these questions.
We do.
Nāgārjuna is slapping the tools away because he's telling us we are asking the wrong questions. We are causing our own anxiety by trying to violently force a fluid, ungraspable, beautiful reality into these rigid, binary linguistic boxes.
That's beautifully said.
When you realize that the boxes themselves are the problem, that reality simply doesn't fit in them, you don't have to fight to fit inside them anymore. You can just let go.
That letting go is the exact liberation the middle way is pointing toward. You cease the exhausting, impossible labor of reification. You stop trying to make the mirage solid.
But I have to ask the ultimate pragmatic question, the rubber meets the road question.
Let's hear it.
If I am not supposed to cling to any concepts, if I'm supposed to exist in this fluid state of total non-attachment without absolute categories, how do I actually live my life tomorrow?
A very fair question.
How do I buy groceries? How do I handle a stressful meeting at work? I can't just float into the boardroom on Monday morning, look at my boss, and tell them that the Q3 earnings report is a karmic mirage, and therefore I didn't finish it.
No, you certainly cannot, unless your goal is to be conventionally fired in the conventional world.
Exactly.
This tension between ultimate emptiness and daily life is exactly what triggers steps 10 and 11, the practical culmination of the entire philosophy.
Let's get practical.
Step 10 is the practice of acting without acting.
Acting without acting. That sounds like a Zen koan. Let's unpack it.
It means acting conventionally, fully participating in the world, without acting in absolute terms. You use the three spheres, the actor, the action, the result, as functional, necessary tools to navigate the world.
But you use them completely without attachment, without reification, and without assuming they define ultimate reality.
You play the game, fully knowing it is a game, and fully knowing the true, empty nature of the board, the pieces, and the players.
I love this framing. Let's apply acting without acting directly to that high-stakes corporate boardroom meeting.
Perfect.
In conventional reality, you still prepare. You build the PowerPoint deck, you study the numbers, you negotiate the terms, you argue your points passionately, and you try your absolute hardest to win the contract.
You deeply respect the conventional truth, because dependent origination dictates that if you don't prepare the slides, you will fail the pitch. Cause and effect still functionally matter.
Exactly. You do not abandon the conventional world into some faux spiritual apathy. You engage.
But acting without acting means that while you are negotiating fiercely, you monitor your mind. You never reify yourself as the absolute winner or the absolute loser.
You never project inherent existence onto the contract, viewing it as the ultimate absolute measure of your worth as a human being.
Right.
So if you win the contract, you celebrate conventionally. You get the bonus. But your ego doesn't inflate into an absolute monster because you know the victory is conditional and temporary.
And more importantly,
If you lose the contract to a rival firm, you feel the conventional disappointment that's natural, but it doesn't shatter your core. You don't suffer the absolute agonized despair of a shattered identity because you knew from the moment you walked in the room that the negotiation, and the contract were a temporary, fluid dance of conditions.
that is a brilliant, grounded application of the middle way. You experience the wave, but you don't forget you are the ocean. Let's take another example from everyday life, perhaps the most universally relatable one. Driving in heavy traffic.
Oh, the ultimate proving ground for enlightenment.
Indeed. You are driving on the highway, and someone aggressively cuts you off, nearly causing a collision.
The worst.
Conventionally, you slam on the brakes to survive. You navigate the physical danger using your reflexes. That is, using the actor and the action conventionally. But what usually happens in the mind a microsecond after you hit the brakes?
The mind instantly builds a rigid, absolute triad. There's the absolute victim, me, the innocent driver. There's the absolute evil action, the aggressive cutoff. And there's the absolute villain, the monster in the other car.
And from that rigid triad, the road rage boils over.
My heart rate spikes, I grip the steering wheel, and my whole day is ruined by anger.
Exactly. You reified the event. You took a fleeting collision of conditions and turned it into an absolute moral drama. But acting without acting means you break to survive conventionally, but you actively refuse to reify the other driver as an absolute enemy.
You recognize that they, too, are an empty, dependently originated nexus of conditions.
Maybe they are rushing to a hospital, maybe they're panicked, distracted by a text, or just conventionally careless. Whatever the cause, you recognize there is no absolute inherent villainness inside their car.
You don't cling to the anger because you realize there is no absolute target to be angry at.
You rest, instead, in suchness.
Suchness. In Sanskrit, tathata. Just letting reality be exactly as it is, fluid, interconnected, occurring without wrapping it in suffocating layers of absolute judgment, ego, and narrative.
Yes, abiding in reality as it is. And this brings us to step 11, the ultimate conclusion of the entire Madhyamaka diagnostic.
Okay.
When you master acting without acting, when you rest in suchness, a profound perceptual shift occurs. You begin to perceive everything, including the actor, the action, and the result, as primordially equal, pure, perfect, complete, divine, and one.
But remember our generalized tetralemma. When we say one, we mean it strictly in the non-dual sense. Not many, not one, not both, not neither.
This shift toward primordial purity connects directly to verse 13, the final verse of chapter 8.
The Strain translation frames it beautifully. In the same way, one should understand the acquiring on the basis of the giving up, etc., of the producer and the product. By means of the product and the producer, all other things should be dissolved.
Nāgārjuna is telling us that once we successfully use this logic to dissolve the absolute reality of the agent and the action, we don't stop there.
We take that exact same solvent and apply it to all remaining entities in our worldview. The entire cycle of grasping things we want and pushing away things we hate is completely dissolved.
It is a universal solvent. And if we zoom out and connect this to the biggest possible picture, to the cosmic implications of this primordial purity, think about what happens to the concept of compassion.
This is so important.
Because the perceiver and the perceived intimately co-create each other, because the actor and the product are entirely interdependent, the hard, absolute boundary between the individual self and the rest of the cosmos completely dissolves.
Because if my very identity is defined by my interaction with you, and your identity is defined by your interaction with me, where do I end and where do you begin? There is no absolute borderline.
There is no border. And in the realization of that borderless reality, boundless compassion arises naturally.
It doesn't arise from some heavy moral obligation or a religious commandment or a pitying savior complex.
It arises logically. Saving another person from suffering becomes as entirely logical, instinctual, and natural as your left hand pulling your right hand out of a fire.
You don't need an ethical philosophy to convince your left hand to help your right hand. You just do it immediately because you recognize the right hand as an inseparable part of the same interconnected system.
Everything is primordially equal and perfect because everything is equally empty and equally intertwined.
That is staggeringly beautiful. It shifts compassion from a heavy ethical duty to a basic law of physics within an empty universe. As we prepare to wrap up this deep dive, I want to try to synthesize this breathtaking vision we've just journeyed through.
Please do. Let's trace the arc.
We started in the clinic of the spiritual physician Nāgārjuna. We looked at the Abhidharma's attempt to secure reality with solid, absolute Lego bricks, the producer, the production, and the product.
Right.
We took those bricks and applied the relentless global 11-step Madhyamaka logic. We used the tetralemma to meticulously, verse by verse, dismantle the idea that these spheres possess any absolute reality.
We saw that absolute existence makes action redundant and frozen, while non-existence makes action impossible.
The conclusion of Chapter 8 is total and uncompromising. The absolute production of karma and the absolute production of anything is thoroughly refuted.
The absolute structures were completely dismantled.
But in the wreckage of that absolute reality, we didn't find a dark nihilistic void. We found dependent origination.
Yes.
We found a centerless, infinite, holographic, fractal loop of causality that is entirely empty of inherent existence. We discovered the radical truth that samsara and nirvana are the exact same world, just perceived with either grasping ignorance or liberated wisdom.
The profound shift in perspective.
We learned that the universe is a highly functional karmic mirage, and the key to living in it is the middle way, acting conventionally, playing the game fiercely, but acting without acting, resting in the primordial purity of suchness, and never reifying the tools we use.
A masterful summary of an incredibly complex journey. You traverse the logic beautifully, and to leave you, our listener, with a final paradigm-shifting thought to mull over on your own. Let's take the solvent of Chapter 8 and apply it to one last concept.
What's the concept?
Let's apply everything we've just discussed about the producer, the action, and the product to our experience of time.
Time, the ultimate triad, past, present, and future.
Exactly. We've meticulously established that the agent and the act are a co-evolving karmic mirage. But what happens when you realize that your rigid categories of past, present, and future are also just an empty triad lacking any inherent existence?
Oh, wow.
If the past is an illusion already gone, completely ungraspable, existing only as a conceptual memory in the present mind, and if the future is an illusion entirely unwritten, dependent on millions of interconnected conditions that haven't even happened yet, what happens to your crushing, paralyzing anxieties about the future? What happens to your heavy, suffocating regrets about the past?
If they lack inherent existence, they vanish. They're revealed as empty grasping at phantoms.
They are phantoms. Now, the present moment is the only illusion you ever actually have to work with.
Now is the only illusion you ever actually have to work with. What a profoundly liberating realization to carry out into the day. Thank you for sitting at the table with us, for pushing through the cognitive vertigo, and for traversing this extraordinary logic. Step out into your primordially perfect day. Go to your meetings, drive in traffic, make your coffee, use your conventional tools. But as you do, remember the feeling of that brick wall. When you look at the world and your mind tries to point to a solid absolute boundary and say, there it is, that's absolute reality. Remember to look closer. Step back, drop the absolute categories, and see the magnificent interconnected mirage for what it truly is.